Good yontif. One thing you learn in rabbinical school is that while Jewish history is long, Jewish history classes can feel even longer. To break it down, to make it more understandable than a series of dates and events, teachers will often come up with clever names or ways of having us remember their different approaches to history. And one of my favorite in terms of its name, just because it sounds kind of fancy, is the lachrymose approach to Jewish history. Lachrymose really just being a fancy word for sad. And this version of history says, we're going to pay focused attention to all the negative things that have happened to the Jewish people throughout history and not pay much attention to the good stuff that happened in between. In a similar vein, Jewish holidays have been summed up as, they tried to kill us, we're here now and they're not, woohoo! Let's eat. Right, sure, as a people we have had more than our share of misfortune. Less than some, yet more than most. And that is a history we need to know. Yet if our Judaism is only guided by the negative events in our history, this pogrom, that expulsion, I'm afraid that is no way to live a life. And that approach misses so much of the joy and celebration of life that is part and essence of Judaism. Instead, I want to share a different description, a different heuristic, a different way of looking at Jewish history, given voice by our very own Kira Ross. Kira is a freshman now at Grimsley High School, but was in Rabbi Rebecca's Judaic Studies class at B'nai Shalom. And in that class, she described Jewish history as a Jenga tower. Jenga, that game that we play where we stack up the wood, right? And she explained her answer. I chose Jenga to be my visual metaphor because at times when Judaism was knocked down, the people built it back up. That's brilliant. It gets even better though. Just like Jenga, when the wood tower is knocked down, you can always rebuild it. And just like Jenga, the Jews didn't always build it up back the same way. It's always going to be Judaism, just like Jenga is always going to be made out of the same blocks. Right? Kira is pointing out that sometimes when we rebuild, we don't replicate the past. Instead, we capture the beauty and the power of the past, but we structure it for the future. In these moments, as we prepare for Yizkor, how we remember and then move forward is an essential issue to discuss for all of us who have lost a loved one. And given the situation that we find our community in, how we rebuild our communal lives as well after this pandemic is an important one as well. And it is one that our tradition offers powerful lessons for. First, let's look at how we've dealt with this in the past as a community. And for this, there is no better example than when the Jewish people rebuilt Judaism after the destruction of the temple. The temple had been the center of Jewish life, the house of God, Beit Elohim, where the priests oversaw the worship each and every day and for every holiday, and it was the center of our lives for about 1,000 years. Jews from throughout the lands would make pilgrimage here on festivals. This was the place to be with the community and the place to be together with God. And then once the Romans destroyed it, and not only destroyed it, but banned Jews from living in Jerusalem or worshiping in Jerusalem, the rabbis faced a dilemma. What do you do when you cannot rebuild what you once had? Well, commenting on this moment in Jewish history, the Talmud teaches us that two rabbis were walking through those very same ruins of Jerusalem and heard a voice calling. As they investigate, Elijah the prophet miraculously appears before them and asks them what they were hearing. This miraculous substantiation of Elijah is something that happens frequently in rabbinic literature. It's kind of as a second voice for God. So Elijah the prophet appears before them and asks them, "What did you hear coming out of the ruins?" Rabbi Yossi replies, "We hear a voice roaring like a lion and saying, 'Woe to the children who have been exiled from their father's table, and woe to the father who has exiled his children from his house.'" That's the voice they hear coming from these ruins of Jerusalem that they cannot rebuild. God here is not describing the destruction that did happen. God is not apportioning blame. God is simply expressing through a statement of utter compassion how profoundly challenged and distant is the connection between God and the people. When we first face loss, the Talmud teaches us, compassion and empathy are our first response. The story does continue, and Elijah tells Rabbi Yossi that this roaring like a lion is not God's only response to the state of the Jewish people. According to Elijah, 3 times a day, when Jews pray, and also whenever Jews enter a house of study, a Beit Midrash, that is, whenever Jews respond, Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mevarach, as part of the Kaddish, God responds declaring, "How fortunate is the king who is praised such in his house." The rabbis took what used to be the house of God, the temple, and have made the Jewish institutions of synagogue or Beit Knesset and Beit Midrash, house of prayer, house of gathering, house of study, the new house of God. In this bold statement of hope and pride, the rabbis, proud of the traditions of prayer and study they are building and developing, put words of praise for their actions into God's mouth, and it is a statement of hope. Hope that their futures will be full of moments when all will be right in the world and they will be in close connection with God, the way they once felt in the temple. The thing that made it possible to turn from sadness and empathy to hope was the way that the rabbis, inspired by our past history with God and the temple, reimagined what Judaism could be without the temple. And as a community, as we make our way out of the pandemic, as we inevitably will, I hope we are able to build forward in a similar fashion. But what of the individual facing loss? The lessons of the story above still apply. God wants us to move forward in a way that continues to connect us with the past. Jewish tradition also guides us here and helps us to take first steps to affirm life. Our traditions here are some of the strongest, some of the most powerful ones we have when we are confronting loss in our lives. For example, the very first moment a mourner returns home from the cemetery, they are meant to eat something. In a moment when we are tempted to give up, to be paralyzed and sit on some low chair, not knowing what to do, tradition guides us to take a first step, to eat a hard-boiled egg, a circle symbolizing that cycle of life, and an egg itself representing the source of life. But there's another profound example that can guide us that is more recent, more personal, and more intense. It is an inspirational fact about the survivors of the Shoah. Now, it goes without saying that their suffering is incomprehensible, but yet we can learn from what they did after, from how they lived their lives forward and what they did next. They had lost an entire world. Most had lost some or all of their family. And then for 3 long years, they were stuck in displaced person camps, DP camps, throughout Europe. What hope could they have had? Citizens of no country, no place to go, seemingly with no future. Yet as a group, they maintained hope, they clung to life, celebrated life, and in fact, in those 3 years, had the highest birth rate in the world. Looking backwards with pain and longing that can't be described, they too were able to build their lives forward. Because sometimes, in the wake of great loss, a clearly defined and predictable path forward is not available. Yet in those moments, we don't give up. We get started doing what we know how to do. Now, the loss that we feel as a community is far from the same level of loss the Jewish people felt either at the destruction of the temple or the Shoah. Yet we also feel a great sense of loss for the normal ways of life that we had and have disappeared because of COVID-19. When we face a loss, either as an individual or as a community, our life as it once was can be compared to a beautiful yet broken ceramic vase. We hold the shards in our hands, each one still beautiful. Yet we are left to wonder, how can we reassemble them? Can we put them back together? What do we do with what remains in the wake of brokenness? Well, the Japanese art form of kintsugi beautifully illustrates an approach that honors brokenness and transforms it into something new and beautiful. Kintsugi is the Japanese art of taking broken pieces of a ceramic vase, for example, and reassembling them using a glue so infused with dust of gold, with gold dust, that when it dries, the seams appear to be solid seams of gold. The original pieces are all there, and the seams between them now shine with the gleam of a precious metal. Instead of trying to make the breaks seem as if they never happened, this art form says, own the brokenness, make it beautiful and shine. Kintsugi is the art of acknowledging brokenness and building beauty forward from it. And it is such a Jewish thing to do. In fact, it might be the most Jewish thing to do. Our history is full of examples. Times when our ancestors looked backwards with sadness and longing for a world destroyed or taken away, and built a new, beautiful world forward, inspired by the past. Through creative explosions, they redirected or rebuilt Judaism for an unknown future. Their successes are why we are here. Their strength is why our tradition is so deep and so powerful. And I've said it before, next Rosh Hashanah seems so very far away. And at this moment, you might be focused on your memories of a loved one and wondering how to rebuild your life in the new year. Or you might be focused on the losses we have faced as a Jewish community and wondering, what future will it bring? Well, now, as we turn to Yizkor, we honor our losses. We feel the connection, even without their physical presence. May we each find ways to individually and together as a community, find ways to move forward and transform our losses into beauty. Ken Yehi Ratzon. May that be God's will.